The night is restless over New York City. Steam rises from the subway grates, mixing with the smell of rain and cigarette smoke. Neon lights tremble in puddles along the streets of Manhattan, where jazz rhythms echo from speakeasies hidden behind unmarked doors. The year is 1925, and the city is alive with hunger for money, pleasure, survival, and above all, power. In this restless city of immigrants and dreamers, a new kind of empire is being born, not of kings or politicians, but of gangsters. And standing at its heart is a man who will redefine what crime means in America, Charles Lucky Luciano. He was not born lucky. He was born Salvatore Lucania, the son of a sulfur miner from Sicily who came to America chasing a myth called the American dream. But New York had no dreams for boys like him, only corners, gangs, and fists. By the time most children were learning their letters, Salvatore was learning how to fight, how to cheat, how to survive. He was not the biggest or the strongest, but he had something rarer, an instinct for people. He could read them, their greed, their fear, their weaknesses. It was this talent, not his muscles, that would make him a legend. The voice of the city in those years was noise and chaos, immigrants shouting in Italian, Yiddish, Irish brogue. Each community formed its own miniature world with its own rules, its own justice. In the back alleys of the Lower East Side, boys like Luciano learned that law was not something written in books, it was written in respect, in fear, in reputation. He discovered early that power came not from obeying rules, but from understanding who could break them and still survive. As the camera of history pans across the city, we see the dual face of America. On one side, skyscrapers rise, Wall Street hums, the promise of wealth glitters in every window. On the other, men and women live stacked in tenements, sweat and despair soaking their clothes. It was here, in this contrast of luxury and misery, that Lucky Luciano began to build his vision, a dream that would take the ruthlessness of the street and the structure of business, and combine them into something entirely new. The 1920s are an age of rebellion. Prohibition has turned the nation dry, but the thirst for alcohol, for pleasure, for sin, only grows stronger. The government says no, and the underworld says yes, for a price. Bootleggers become businessmen, and criminals become celebrities. This is the stage where Lucky Luciano will step forward, not as a mere gangster, but as an architect of an invisible kingdom. His empire will stretch across states, built not with loyalty alone, but with calculation, discipline, and an understanding of human nature that borders on genius. He is not yet the powerful figure he will become, but already his story carries the contradictions that define him. He will be both visionary and villain, reformer and tyrant. The same intelligence that allows him to bring order to chaos will also make him dangerous, because he sees people not as individuals, but as pieces on a chessboard. His rise will not be driven by cruelty, but by logic, a belief that every system, even one built on crime, can be perfected. There is something almost American in his ambition. The same hunger that drives Wall Street brokers and oil magnates drives him too. Only his commodities are different: liquor, gambling, flesh, and fear. To the newspapers, he will become the face of corruption; to those who know him, he will become the man who gave structure to chaos. He does not want fame, he wants control. He does not seek glory, he seeks permanence. As the lights of Manhattan flicker against the night sky, Luciano stands at the edge of a dock, watching the ships move in and out of the harbor. Somewhere out there, beyond the fog, lies the world he intends to rule. He does not yet know how many lives will be broken, how much blood will be spilled, or how his own name will one day be whispered like a legend. All he knows is that he will not die poor, and he will not die forgotten. The music swells, a mix of jazz and menace, as the narrative opens not just on one man's journey, but on the birth of an empire. The mafia, as America will come to know it, is about to evolve. It will wear suits instead of rags, talk business instead of vendetta, and infiltrate the highest towers of the American dream. And the man leading it will be both its creator and its curse. The story of Lucky Luciano begins here, in the shadows of ambition, in the pulse of New York, in the restless heart of a man who saw power as the truest form of freedom. By the time the decade ends, he will have reshaped the criminal world, rewritten its laws, and built a dynasty that would endure long after he is gone. But for now, he is only a name whispered in backrooms, a sharp-dressed nobody with dangerous eyes. The world has not yet learned his lesson, that power, once taken, never truly belongs to anyone. It only waits for the next man bold enough to claim it. At the dawn of the 20th century, New York was a storm of humanity. Ships from Europe arrived every day, carrying families who had sold everything for a ticket to the New World. They came with calloused hands, worn shoes, and hope stitched into their coats. But the city that greeted them was not the land of freedom they had imagined. It was a battlefield of survival, crowded, filthy, and merciless. For Sicilian immigrants like Antonio and Rosalia Lucania, it was a place of both promise and punishment. They settled in the Lower East Side, a dense maze of tenements where thousands of families lived piled on top of one another. The air smelled of coal smoke and boiled cabbage. The streets echoed with the cries of pushcart vendors and the shrill whistle of factory shifts. It was in this world that their son, Salvatore, was born in 1897. From the beginning, the odds were stacked against him. His family's small apartment was one room shared among many, no privacy, little food, no luxury except survival. His father worked long hours as a laborer, earning barely enough to keep bread on the table. His mother scrubbed floors and washed clothes for neighbors. There was no softness, no space for dreams. Every corner of the city taught the same harsh lesson: if you didn't fight for what you wanted, someone else would take it from you. The American dream for families like the Lucanias was a cruel joke. Signs outside shops read, "No Italians need apply." Landlords and policemen treated them as outsiders. In the eyes of the city, they were the bottom rung, uneducated, unwanted, and dangerous. So, the Sicilian community built its own ecosystem of trust and protection. Each block became a village, governed by respect and silence. And within these enclaves, a different kind of order thrived, one rooted in fear, loyalty, and blood. The seeds of the mafia had been carried across the Atlantic, and they found fertile ground in the cracks of America's promise. For young Salvatore, school offered little escape. He spoke broken English, was mocked by teachers, and bullied by other children. He quickly learned that strength meant survival, and cleverness meant success. He began skipping class, running errands for older boys who ruled the corners. By 10 years old, he had joined his first street gang. They called themselves the 5 Points Juniors, named after the infamous neighborhood that once defined New York's criminal past. They were small-time hustlers, snatching wallets, shaking down delivery boys, and collecting protection money from local vendors. To them, it was not crime. It was business. But even at that age, there was something different about Salvatore. While others chased quick thrills, he studied the men who truly held power, the ones who didn't have to shout or fight, the ones who gave orders from the back rooms of bars. He watched how respect was earned, how fear could be used like currency. He began to understand that violence was not the real weapon, control was. At night, the young Luciano walked the narrow streets of Mulberry and Broome, past gambling dens and brothels where men with money and influence met in whispers. He saw politicians shaking hands with gangsters, priests blessing criminals, and police officers taking envelopes in the dark. The line between law and crime was thin, and sometimes invisible. To a boy from nothing, it was a revelation: everyone was playing the same game, only the rich did it with better clothes and cleaner hands. The older generation of Italian immigrants clung to the traditions of the old world, the strict codes of respect, the silence of omerta, the belief that problems were solved among their own kind. They distrusted outsiders and despised anyone who broke the old rules. But to Salvatore, these customs felt like chains. He didn't want to be a peasant in America as his father had been in Sicily. He wanted power, the kind that made the police nod in fear and made judges look away. During his teenage years, Luciano started to see the underworld as a system waiting to be organized. The Irish gangs had their unions, the Jewish gangs had their networks, and the Italians had their pride, but no unity. Each group fought for scraps, killing each other over blocks and corners while politicians made fortunes off their chaos. Luciano understood that this disunity was weakness. He saw the future in alliances, not vendettas. In this divided world, he would become the bridge. As the First World War raged in Europe, the streets of New York continued their own silent war. Gangs battled for territory, and blood ran in the gutters after every deal gone wrong. Luciano climbed quietly through the ranks. He became known not for cruelty, but for his composure. He had an unusual calm, even in violence. When he spoke, men listened. When he smiled, it was never clear whether it meant friendship or warning. The name, Lucky, would come later, after a brutal beating and a miraculous survival. But even before the name, the myth was forming. Those who knew him said he had a strange aura, a sense that he was destined for something larger than the streets he walked. At the same time, the world around him was transforming. America was becoming a machine of industry and opportunity, but for those in the shadows, it was also becoming a land of black markets and secret fortunes. The government's attempt to impose morality through prohibition would soon create the greatest economic opportunity for criminals in history. And when that door opened, Lucky Luciano would be among the first to walk through it. The immigrant boy who once fought for nickels on the corner was now beginning to think in millions. He understood that America's greatest weakness was its own appetite, the hunger for pleasure, for escape, for indulgence. If he could satisfy that hunger, he could control it. And if he could control it, he could rule it. In the old Sicilian villages, men like Luciano's father believed destiny was written by God. In New York, Salvatore Lucania decided destiny could be written by anyone bold enough to seize it. He would not be defined by poverty or prejudice. He would define himself, through fear, through strategy, through power. And so, while the rest of America dreamed of freedom, Luciano began dreaming of domination. The streets that had once beaten him down would soon bow to him. The boy from Sicily was gone. In his place was a man who had learned the first truth of power: in a world built on dreams, control belongs to those who understand human weakness, and are willing to exploit it. The transformation from Salvatore Lucania into Lucky Luciano was not a moment, but a slow evolution, a series of choices carved out of survival, ambition, and instinct. The boy who once ran errands for pennies had become a teenager who understood the psychology of fear. He was streetwise, charming, and ruthless when he needed to be. New York in the 1910s was a living battlefield, and the streets were his school. He learned that people didn't just obey strength, they obeyed confidence, charisma, and reputation. By the time he was 16, he already had all three. He began running with the 5 Points Gang, a notorious melting pot of Irish, Italian, and Jewish delinquents who operated under the guidance of Paul Kelly, a sophisticated gangster who dressed like a gentleman and talked like a politician. Kelly was not a thug, he was a strategist, and Luciano watched him closely. Kelly believed that organized crime could only survive if it adapted, if it learned to blend into society rather than fight it. It was the first time Luciano saw what power looked like when it wore a suit. Paul Kelly's mentorship changed everything. Luciano learned to manage gambling operations, extortion rackets, and bootlegging ventures. But more importantly, he learned discipline. Kelly taught him that violence was a tool, not a habit, that true power was invisible. He began to distance himself from the reckless brutality of the street gangs. Where others chased fear, Luciano chased respect. He realized that to control men, you had to give them something greater than threats, you had to give them belief. It was around this time that he met two young men who would shape his destiny forever, Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Meyer, a small, sharp-eyed Jewish boy from Belarus, shared Luciano's intelligence and vision. Where Lucky was street cunning, Meyer was cerebral. He saw crime as mathematics, numbers, systems, and probabilities. Bugsy, in contrast, was pure volatility, handsome, fearless, and violent in a way that frightened even his friends. Together, they were the perfect trinity of brains, balance, and brutality. Luciano and Lansky's friendship was something rare in that era, a partnership that defied the rigid ethnic lines dividing the underworld. Italians worked with Italians, Jews with Jews, Irish with Irish. But the two young men saw beyond that. They recognized that money had no nationality, and that loyalty was stronger when built on mutual interest rather than blood. It was this understanding that would later revolutionize the entire criminal landscape of America. Through Lansky, Luciano learned organization. Through Siegel, he learned boldness. But through himself, he learned patience. He was ambitious, but never reckless. When a rival insulted him, he didn't reach for a gun, he waited. He studied. He planned. Every move was deliberate, every friendship calculated. To some, this made him cold. To others, it made him inevitable. By the early 1920s, Luciano had built a name that carried weight in both the Italian and Jewish communities. He wasn't the biggest gangster, but he was one of the most respected. He had earned the nickname Lucky after surviving an abduction and a savage beating that left him scarred but alive. No one knew exactly who had targeted him, some said rivals, others said police, but the story only added to his mystique. The scars on his face became his signature, a reminder that he could take punishment and still rise. That survival changed him. From that point on, he treated luck not as chance, but as destiny. He began to see himself as untouchable, chosen. Every deal he made, every risk he took seemed to work in his favor. The underworld whispered his name with a mixture of admiration and fear. Lucky wasn't just a name, it was a prophecy. During Prohibition, his ambitions found their perfect storm. In 1920, the United States government banned alcohol, hoping to purify the nation. Instead, it turned everyday citizens into criminals and gave rise to the most profitable black market in history. Overnight, liquor became liquid gold, and bootlegging became an empire waiting to be seized. Luciano saw the opportunity instantly. He began forging alliances with powerful figures like Arnold Rothstein, the infamous gambler and fixer who had financed the 1919 World Series scandal. Rothstein was a mentor in the art of sophistication. He taught Luciano how to launder money, bribe officials, and disguise crime as business. From him, Luciano learned that success wasn't about breaking laws, it was about bending them until they served you. Luciano quickly expanded his operations, coordinating shipments of Canadian whiskey and Caribbean rum through the docks of Manhattan. He paid off customs officials, policemen, and politicians with the precision of a corporate executive. For every bottle of liquor seized by authorities, 10 slipped through under his control. His earnings soared into millions, but more importantly, his influence began to stretch across boroughs and ethnic boundaries. While other gangsters flaunted their wealth in cars and jewelry, Luciano invested in people. He placed loyal men in key positions, building a network that functioned like a business. He demanded loyalty, but he also rewarded it generously. To him, leadership was not about fear alone, it was about reliability. If you take care of your men, he often said, they'll take care of your business. But the more power he gained, the clearer he saw the chaos around him. The Italian mafia was divided into dozens of factions, each loyal to an old country boss who ruled by blood, not brains. They clung to ancient traditions, fought over territory, and killed for pride. Luciano found it exhausting, and inefficient. He wanted something different, an organized, structured system where business could thrive without unnecessary violence. He began envisioning a new kind of underworld, one that mirrored legitimate corporations, with hierarchies, profit sharing, and clear rules. It was an idea far ahead of its time, born not from greed but from order. We could make more money, he told Lansky, if we stopped killing each other. In those words lay the blueprint of modern organized crime. Luciano wasn't thinking like a gangster anymore. He was thinking like a CEO. By 1925, his name had become synonymous with intelligence and ambition. Politicians sought his influence, police officers accepted his bribes, and rival bosses both feared and respected him. Yet for all his power, Luciano remained grounded in one simple truth: everything could be bought or negotiated, except betrayal. In private moments, he still remembered the streets of his childhood, the hunger in his family's apartment, the humiliation of being treated as less than human. Those memories didn't fade, they fueled him. Every dollar he made was a victory against the world that once spat on him. Every connection, every scheme, every empire he built was his revenge on the American dream that had refused to include him. The man once called Salvatore Lucania had disappeared into history's shadow. In his place stood Lucky Luciano, sharp suit, slick hair, scarred smile. A man who would go on to redefine the very nature of power in America. He was no longer chasing survival, he was shaping destiny. And though he didn't yet know it, the empire he was about to create would change the criminal world forever, turning street crime into an institution, and gangsters into businessmen. The rise of Lucky Luciano was more than a personal triumph, it was the birth of a new order, a silent revolution that would transform the underworld into something bigger, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. The boy from Sicily had become the man who would teach America that power, once organized, could be unstoppable. The 1920s were roaring across America like a fever dream. Jazz, speakeasies, and a restless energy filled every corner of New York. The Great War was over, and the country was intoxicated with excess. But beneath the glitter and the gin, there was an underworld simmering with blood and ambition, a world divided between the old and the new, tradition and innovation. It was within this chaotic landscape that Lucky Luciano began to see his purpose not as a gangster, but as a reformer of crime itself. He had survived the streets, mastered the art of business, and now, he wanted to build something greater, a system, an empire, an order carved from disorder. To understand the magnitude of Luciano's vision, one must first understand the world he sought to change. The mafia in the early 1920s was not the sleek, efficient network it would later become. It was a mess of fractured families, regional loyalties, and ancient vendettas imported from the old country. The Sicilians, Neapolitans, and Calabrians who ruled their respective corners of New York operated like feudal lords, each defending his territory with brutal zeal. Every insult demanded revenge, every betrayal demanded blood. Their wars were personal, endless, and costly. To Luciano, it all seemed primitive. He had grown up among these men, heard their oaths, witnessed their rituals, watched them slit throats for honor, but he never believed in the sanctity of their traditions. He believed in results. The code of omerta, the old world silence, had value, but it also kept the mafia locked in a cycle of stagnation. The Dons were obsessed with pride, Luciano was obsessed with profit. Where they saw enemies, he saw potential partners. Where they sought revenge, he saw opportunity. At this time, one of the most powerful figures in New York's Italian underworld was Joe, the boss, Masuria. A cunning, heavy-set man with a taste for fine cigars and an iron grip on his soldiers, Masuria ruled through fear and favoritism. He was everything Luciano despised, loud, arrogant, and unwilling to adapt. But Luciano, always the strategist, aligned himself with Masuria. He played the loyal lieutenant, running his operations efficiently, earning trust while quietly building his own network behind the scenes. He understood that to change the system, he first had to work within it. Meanwhile, the landscape of crime was evolving. Prohibition had turned ordinary businessmen into smugglers and gangsters into millionaires. Speakeasies flourished under the neon haze of the city, and behind every glass of whiskey was a chain of corruption stretching from the docks to City Hall. The old mafia families were making fortunes, but their greed was matched only by their chaos. Deals collapsed under suspicion, allies turned into rivals, and violence became the currency of power. Luciano began to see that this constant warfare was not just dangerous, it was bad business. He watched how the Jewish gangs, led by Meyer Lansky and Arnold Rothstein's protégés, handled their affairs with precision and pragmatism. They didn't waste time on vendettas, they negotiated, compromised, moved forward. The Irish syndicates, too, had learned to work with politicians rather than against them. The Italians, in contrast, were stuck in their own pride. Luciano saw that if he could unify these competing factions under one structure, one set of rules, he could control not just the streets, but the entire underworld economy. By 1928, the first cracks in the old system began to show. The Sicilian bosses were aging, their methods outdated. A new generation, men like Luciano, Lansky, Siegel, and Frank Costello, had grown up in America. They understood both cultures, the loyalty of the old world and the ambition of the new. To them, crime was no longer about neighborhood dominance, it was about national networks, political influence, and diversification. Luciano began to imagine an underworld without borders, where power wasn't dictated by bloodline but by capability. Yet the old guard would not give up control easily. Men like Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, both powerful and paranoid, viewed Luciano's ideas as heresy. To them, the mafia was sacred, built on honor and family. To Luciano, it was a business waiting to be modernized. The tension between these worlds, the old and the new, was reaching a boiling point. Luciano began to make moves that would eventually change everything. He cultivated friendships across ethnic lines, bringing together Irish and Jewish gangsters to form what newspapers would later call the Syndicate. These alliances were radical in a world defined by prejudice and suspicion. But Luciano didn't care about tradition, he cared about results. Business is business, he would say. It don't matter what color you are, what religion you are. If you make money for me, you're my friend. This philosophy made him both respected and feared. To the old dons, he was a traitor, a young upstart with too much ambition. To his peers, he was a visionary. The streets buzzed with rumors of his meetings, his secret deals, his growing influence. Even as he outwardly served Masuria, he was already designing a new structure, one that would eliminate unnecessary bloodshed and distribute power evenly among the bosses. His plan was simple in theory but revolutionary in practice: turn organized crime into a cooperative system. Each family would control its territory but answer to a higher council. Disputes would be resolved through arbitration, not murder. Profits would be shared, alliances maintained. It was a concept borrowed from corporate America, translated into the language of crime. Luciano's mind worked like a chessboard. Every alliance he made, every favor he granted, was a calculated move. He was patient, waiting for the right moment to strike, when the old lions would tear each other apart, and he could rise from the ashes as the architect of a new order. But even as he built his silent revolution, the streets were becoming more dangerous. Rivalries flared between Masuria and Maranzano's camps, leading to ambushes, kidnappings, and endless retaliation. Luciano found himself walking a razor's edge, maintaining the illusion of loyalty to Masuria while secretly preparing to overthrow him. It was a delicate balance of deception and diplomacy, one misstep away from death. At night, as the city slept, Luciano would meet with Lansky and Costello in dimly lit backrooms, drawing out their vision for what they called the future. They spoke not of gangs or vendettas, but of corporations, territories, and influence. They were businessmen with guns, men who understood that in America, the most powerful institution wasn't the church or the government, it was money. And in this America of contradictions, where law and crime shared the same dinner tables, and morality bent beneath the weight of greed, Luciano's dream of order began to take shape. He no longer wanted to be just another boss. He wanted to be the one who made the rules, who decided the balance between chaos and control. He knew the path ahead would demand blood. Old empires do not die quietly. But Luciano had accepted that price long ago. To build something enduring, something that would outlive him, he would first have to destroy everything that came before. The streets of New York were about to burn. The old mafia was collapsing under its own weight, and in the ruins, Luciano would build his masterpiece, a criminal empire run not by superstition, but by strategy. The world of crime was about to enter its modern age, and Lucky Luciano was the man who would drag it there, one calculated move at a time. The streets of New York in the early 1930s were awash with blood. The city's underworld, already tense from Prohibition's endless profits, erupted into a violent struggle that would later be remembered as the Castellammarese War. Two dominant forces vied for control: Joe, the boss, Masuria, the old Sicilian guard who demanded absolute loyalty and ruled with an iron fist, and Salvatore Maranzano, a cunning rival from Castellammarese, Sicily, determined to carve his own dominion. For the ordinary citizen, this conflict was invisible, just whispers of gunfire in the alleys, a missing man here, a sudden murder there. For the criminal world, it was an apocalypse, a reckoning that would redefine the rules of power forever. Lucky Luciano, now in his early 30s, watched the escalating chaos with both apprehension and opportunity. He had risen through the ranks under Masuria's mentorship, earning trust, running profitable operations, and establishing his reputation as calm, intelligent, and unflinchingly strategic. But he also understood that loyalty to the old guard could be a trap. Masuria was rigid, obsessed with tradition, and blind to the possibilities of modernizing the mafia. The war between Masuria and Maranzano was more than a battle over territory, it was a conflict between old-world pride and new-world pragmatism. Luciano knew that survival required careful calculation, patience, and above all, vision. The early months of the war were chaotic and brutal. Assassinations were common, each side attempting to assert dominance through terror. Street corners became battlefields, and informants and enforcers were killed without hesitation. Luciano navigated this deadly landscape with precision. He cultivated relationships with key players on both sides, maintaining the appearance of loyalty to Masuria while quietly assessing opportunities. Unlike many of his peers, he was not swayed by immediate emotion or vendetta, he measured every move as part of a larger plan. Behind closed doors, Luciano began to orchestrate alliances that crossed traditional boundaries. He communicated with Maranzano's lieutenants and with Jewish and Irish gang leaders, emphasizing mutual profit over personal grudges. His philosophy was clear: unnecessary bloodshed weakened the empire, cooperation strengthened it. This was a dangerous game. One misstep, and Luciano could be killed for perceived disloyalty. But his intelligence, charisma, and reputation for fairness allowed him to navigate these treacherous waters. He became a pivot around which the war turned, a strategist whose foresight was unmatched among his contemporaries. The tension reached a critical point in 1931. Masuria, increasingly paranoid and obsessed with crushing his enemies, demanded absolute obedience from all under his command. His brutality alienated many, including Luciano. Secret meetings were held in shadowed backrooms, where plans were whispered and allegiances tested. Luciano, sensing the inevitability of Masuria's downfall, began arranging for a decisive strike, one that would not only end the war but also position him as the architect of a new order. Then came the pivotal moment. On April 15, 1931, Luciano executed a plan that would shock the underworld. In a calculated betrayal, he arranged for the assassination of Masuria at a Coney Island restaurant. The hit was swift, clean, and precise, a demonstration not of rage, but of tactical genius. Masuria's death sent shockwaves through the criminal community, leaving a vacuum that could have descended into chaos. But Luciano had already thought several steps ahead. He moved quickly to negotiate with Maranzano, ostensibly offering loyalty while simultaneously preparing to dismantle the old hierarchy. Maranzano, ambitious and cunning, soon declared himself capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses, expecting to consolidate power over New York's families. But he underestimated Luciano's vision and political acumen. While Maranzano adhered to rigid Sicilian traditions and demanded fealty, Luciano was quietly assembling a coalition of younger, more pragmatic gangsters who shared his belief in organization over vengeance. He began plotting another bold move, a second strike that would eliminate Maranzano and establish a more democratic structure for organized crime. The assassination of Maranzano, carried out later that same year, was as symbolic as it was practical. The old guard, with its obsession for lineage, codes, and personal revenge, was swept aside. In its place rose a new order, an underworld led not by fear alone, but by strategy, negotiation, and efficiency. Luciano's actions were not merely violent, they were revolutionary. He had redefined power itself, demonstrating that leadership required vision, patience, and the courage to betray tradition when necessary. But this rise was not without moral complexity. To orchestrate these murders, Luciano had to manipulate friends, leverage loyalties, and orchestrate deception at every level. He felt the weight of each life taken, yet he justified it as the cost of progress. His psychological acuity allowed him to compartmentalize, seeing each death as a chess piece moved in a larger game rather than as a tragedy. It was this combination of ruthlessness and intellect that marked him as more than a gangster. He was a strategist, an architect of an entirely new criminal world. The Castellammare's War also revealed Luciano's understanding of public perception. He carefully managed his image, ensuring that while his rivals were known for bloodlust, he was seen as calculated, intelligent, and fair-minded to those under his protection. This duality, both feared and respected, became a hallmark of his leadership style. Allies were loyal, rivals cautious, and enemies uncertain of his next move. It was a balance of power that required constant attention, negotiation, and foresight. By the end of 1931, the war had reshaped the landscape of organized crime in America. The old Sicilian traditions, based on rigid hierarchy and endless vendettas, had been replaced by a system that prioritized efficiency, alliances, and profit. Luciano had not only survived a brutal civil war within the mafia, but he had emerged as its undisputed architect. His genius lay not just in killing his enemies, but in envisioning a structure where murder would no longer be the primary tool of control. Violence became selective, strategy became primary, and leadership required intelligence as much as courage. In these formative months, Luciano cemented his legacy as more than a survivor of New York streets. He became a revolutionary of crime. The Castellammare's War was his crucible, testing every instinct, every relationship, and every strategy. By the time the smoke cleared, he had demonstrated that true power required vision, patience, and the audacity to reshape the rules themselves. Lucky Luciano had not simply risen, he had transformed the very nature of the criminal world, creating a model that would endure for decades and inspire the modern organized crime networks we recognize today. The war was over, but its consequences would reverberate forever. Luciano had ascended, not through brute force alone, but through intellect, timing, and psychological mastery. He had learned that leadership in crime, as in life, demanded more than courage, it demanded understanding, manipulation, and the willingness to act decisively when the moment arrived. In the ruins of the old mafia, a new empire was born, and at its center stood Lucky Luciano, the young man from Sicily who had learned to turn chaos into power. By the early 1930s, the streets of New York had been reshaped by Lucky Luciano's vision. The chaotic violence of the Castellammare's War had cleared a path for a new order, one that valued strategy over bloodlust, alliances over vendettas, and efficiency over tradition. Luciano had survived where others had perished, and now he faced a monumental task, turning a fractured underworld into a coherent, functioning empire. What he built next would not be just another gang, it would be a revolutionary system of organized crime, a structure so innovative that it would define the mafia in America for decades to come. Luciano's first step was the creation of what he would call the Commission. Unlike the old system, which placed a single don at the pinnacle of power, the Commission was designed to be a council of equals, a governing body where disputes could be arbitrated without endless bloodshed. Each major family retained control over its territory, but they were answerable to the collective. Decisions about business, territory, and punishment would be debated and agreed upon, rather than enforced unilaterally. It was an unprecedented move, a blend of diplomacy and ruthless pragmatism that reflected Luciano's understanding of both human nature and economics. To make the Commission work, Luciano had to navigate a delicate balance of personalities. The mafia was filled with egos as large as their ambition. Older dons were accustomed to absolute authority, while younger gangsters bristled at interference. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to persuade, intimidate, and manipulate simultaneously. He presented the commission not as a threat to power, but as a mechanism for stability and profit. To the ambitious and the wary alike, it was a system that promised security, protection for the obedient, consequences for the disloyal. It was both carrot and stick, administered with precision. He also recognized the importance of ethnic alliances. Where his predecessors had maintained rigid divisions between Sicilian, Neapolitan, Jewish, and Irish gangs, Luciano encouraged cooperation. He understood that profit had no loyalty, and survival required flexibility. Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel became vital partners, bridging gaps and fostering trust between groups that would have previously been enemies. The commission was more than governance. It was the embodiment of Luciano's philosophy that intelligence and organization could triumph over tradition and brute force. Within this new structure, Luciano codified the rules of engagement. Violence was no longer the default solution. Murder, extortion, and intimidation were tools to be used judiciously, not impulses to be acted upon. Disputes would first be mediated through meetings, disagreements escalated only when negotiations failed. By institutionalizing such principles, Luciano transformed organized crime from a fragmented street operation into a quasi-corporate network. Each family had responsibilities, each boss had authority, but all operated within an agreed framework designed to maximize profit and minimize disruption. The efficiency of this system extended beyond violence. Luciano applied business logic to all aspects of his empire. Revenue streams were diversified. Gambling operations, prostitution rings, labor rackets, narcotics trafficking, and bootlegging ventures were coordinated to avoid overlap and maximize returns. Each operation had managers, enforcers, and accountants, roles assigned according to skill and loyalty. Corruption was leveraged strategically. Politicians, police officers, and union leaders were carefully cultivated to protect interests and ensure smooth operations. Every dollar that flowed through his network was tracked and optimized. Luciano's psychological insight was central to the commission's success. He understood that fear could motivate, but loyalty endured only when mixed with respect and opportunity. Subordinates were rewarded for obedience, initiative, and reliability. Informants and betrayers were eliminated with precision. By combining incentive with intimidation, Luciano created a system in which obedience became both rational and profitable. The modern criminal enterprise, with its hierarchy, codified rules, and centralized oversight, was emerging under his direction. Yet Luciano did not stop at organizational reform. He also transformed the culture of crime. Whereas the old mafia was insular, secretive, and steeped in superstition, Luciano emphasized pragmatism and rational decision-making. His meetings were analytical, his strategies meticulous. He assessed potential alliances like a businessman evaluating mergers. He considered risks and benefits before executing any action. In many ways, he turned organized crime into a science, applying logic where others relied on tradition, emotion, or brute force. The impact of these innovations was immediate. Turf wars declined, profits increased, and the mafia became more resilient to external pressure. Police raids and public scrutiny continued, but the network's sophistication allowed it to absorb shocks and maintain operations. Luciano's reputation grew as a visionary, his influence extended beyond the Italian-American underworld to the national criminal landscape. He had not only survived the chaos of the streets but had converted it into a system that could endure, expand, and generate immense wealth. Alliances with figures like Lansky and Siegel also gave Luciano access to the emerging organized crime networks in other cities, from Chicago to Philadelphia. The commission became a coordinating hub, managing disputes, facilitating cooperation, and expanding influence. Luciano's empire was no longer confined to New York, it was national, interconnected, and adaptive. He had created an underworld infrastructure that mirrored legitimate business practices, with the added advantage of operating outside the law. But creating the commission also required cunning and ruthlessness behind the scenes. Many older bosses resisted, and some saw Luciano's reforms as a threat to their autonomy. He neutralized these threats through a combination of diplomacy, subtle intimidation, and, when necessary, violence. Every assassination, every threat, every strategic partnership was carefully calculated to consolidate power while maintaining the appearance of fairness. The genius of Luciano's approach was that it made resistance seem futile, compliance was the rational choice, and betrayal carried consequences too severe to risk. By the mid-1930s, the American Mafia had been transformed. What had once been a fractured, unpredictable collection of street gangs and family feuds had become a coordinated, hierarchical network with rules, governance, and oversight. Luciano had institutionalized the Mafia, creating a structure that was both flexible and disciplined, capable of withstanding internal rivalries and external pressures. It was a blueprint for organized crime worldwide, a system that would endure long after his own time. Through the commission, Lucky Luciano achieved what few could imagine. He turned chaos into order, violence into strategy, and ambition into a sustainable empire. He had not merely survived the streets of New York, he had reshaped them. His genius lay not just in brutality or luck, but in foresight, diplomacy, and psychological acuity. By blending old-world cunning with new-world pragmatism, Luciano became more than a mobster, he became the architect of modern organized crime, a man whose influence would extend far beyond the borders of his city and the limits of his own life. The Mafia under Luciano was no longer simply a network of criminals, it was a business, a political force, and a social institution. Its power was invisible yet omnipresent, infiltrating unions, city government, and legitimate enterprises. Through the commission, Luciano had achieved what few had dared to imagine. He had institutionalized crime, ensuring that the chaos of the streets served not as a threat, but as a foundation for enduring power. And in doing so, he cemented his place as the undisputed architect of the American Mafia, a man whose vision would define organized crime for generations to come. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano's rise had transformed him from a street-level hustler into the most influential figure in the American underworld. Yet even as his power solidified, the world he navigated remained treacherous. Alliances were fragile, rivalries simmered beneath polite facades, and betrayal could strike from the most unexpected quarters. Luciano knew that leadership in the Mafia required not only vision and strategy, but also an acute understanding of human nature, the desires, fears, and ambitions that drove every ally and adversary alike. His ability to manage these dynamics would determine whether he could maintain his empire or see it crumble under the weight of envy and deceit. One of the central challenges in maintaining power was managing relationships with other mobsters, both allies and rivals. On the one hand were figures like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, his trusted partners whose intelligence, loyalty, and ambition complemented Luciano's own. Lansky, the cerebral operator, excelled at financial strategy, planning operations with meticulous precision. Siegel, in contrast, brought audacity and fearlessness to their ventures, willing to take risks that others would shy away from. Together, they formed the core team that helped Luciano transform organized crime from fragmented chaos into a structured, profit-driven enterprise. But loyalty was never guaranteed. Many older bosses, steeped in old-world traditions, viewed Luciano's reforms with suspicion. Joe Bonanno, Vincent Mangano, and other family heads bristled at the concept of the commission and the idea of cooperation across ethnic lines. They were accustomed to the singular authority of a capo di tutti capi, a system that placed power in one man's hands and demanded unquestioning obedience. Luciano's egalitarian council threatened their control, and tension simmered as these men weighed whether to adapt or resist. To navigate this, Luciano relied on a combination of diplomacy, intimidation, and careful manipulation. He cultivated relationships, offering incentives to loyalists while neutralizing potential threats with subtlety and precision. Rivalries, however, were inevitable. Some figures, such as Vito Genovese, were ambitious and impatient, chafing under Luciano's authority. Genovese's desire for dominance posed a constant challenge, requiring Luciano to assert control without provoking open rebellion. At the same time, other mobsters from outside New York, particularly in Chicago and Philadelphia, watched Luciano's consolidation of power warily. Al Capone, though more focused on his own empire, represented a broader context in which Luciano's influence had to be negotiated carefully. The art of alliance building, therefore, became a daily exercise in psychological strategy, balancing respect, fear, and incentive. Luciano's understanding of human behavior extended beyond his immediate circle. He knew that control of the mafia required insight into the motivations of every subordinate and competitor. Loyalty was often transactional, ambition was a currency. He observed who sought glory, who sought security, and who sought vengeance. By positioning himself as the arbiter of opportunity and the distributor of reward, Luciano ensured that his network remained cohesive even amid internal tensions. Men followed him not merely because of fear, but because he offered them advancement, protection, and the chance to participate in unprecedented wealth. Alliances with non-Italian gangs were equally strategic. Luciano recognized that the Jewish and Irish criminal networks held considerable influence over lucrative operations, from gambling to labor rackets. By forging partnerships with these groups, he expanded his reach, diversified his income streams, and created a web of interdependence that discouraged conflict. Meyer Lansky, with his cultural and financial acumen, became instrumental in bridging these gaps, ensuring that ethnic divisions did not undermine operational efficiency. These alliances also positioned Luciano as a mediator, capable of resolving disputes before they escalated into violence. Yet trust remained fragile. Even allies could become rivals if opportunity outweighed loyalty. Luciano's brilliance lay in preemptive strategy. He anticipated challenges before they materialized, calculated potential moves by both friends and enemies, and neutralized threats quietly when necessary. Hits were sometimes arranged not out of revenge but to maintain stability, to prevent ambition from undermining the broader structure. Violence became a tool of control, wielded with precision rather than passion. The psychological dimension of Luciano's leadership was equally critical in managing enemies. He understood that fear alone could not sustain authority. Instead, he combined intimidation with pragmatism, creating a reputation that inspired both respect and caution. Stories of his ruthlessness were balanced with accounts of fairness and strategic brilliance, producing a mystique that reinforced his dominance. Rivals were left uncertain of his next move, a mental edge that allowed him to dictate terms without firing a single shot in many cases. Luciano also leveraged politics to strengthen his position. By cultivating relationships with politicians, union leaders, and law enforcement officials, he created an additional layer of protection for his operations. Allies within the system ensured that his businesses could operate with minimal disruption, while opponents found themselves isolated or compromised. This integration of political influence into his criminal network further solidified his dominance and reduced the number of active threats to his authority. Even within his inner circle, Luciano maintained careful oversight. He encouraged initiative, allowing trusted lieutenants to manage day-to-day operations, while keeping ultimate decision-making centralized. This balance of autonomy and control fostered loyalty, rewarded competence, and minimized resentment. Subordinates understood that advancement required both skill and allegiance, creating a meritocratic dimension within a violent, hierarchical system. By the late 1930s, Luciano had effectively neutralized or co-opted most of his rivals. The once fragmented underworld had been transformed into a disciplined, cooperative network with him at its center. But the constant need for vigilance never ceased. Ambition, greed, and the human propensity for betrayal were always present. Luciano's genius lay in recognizing this reality and structuring his empire to anticipate and absorb these challenges, maintaining cohesion through a blend of psychological insight, strategic alliances, and calculated ruthlessness. In the end, his relationships with allies and enemies alike were a reflection of his larger philosophy: power was not merely seized, it was managed. Control required intelligence, foresight, and the ability to navigate human weakness. Through careful balance, Luciano ensured that his influence extended far beyond his immediate operations, creating a system in which loyalty was rewarded, ambition was channeled, and rivals were neutralized without necessarily destroying the enterprise. By mastering the delicate interplay of allies and enemies, Luciano secured not only his personal survival but the stability and expansion of his empire. He had learned that in the criminal world, as in life, understanding the psychology of others was more powerful than violence alone. Through strategy, diplomacy, and selective ruthlessness, Lucky Luciano became not just a mob boss, but the architect of an enduring criminal network, capable of withstanding the test of both human ambition and the pressures of the law. The 1930s in New York were a paradox of glamour and danger. The city pulsed with nightlife, jazz clubs, and the clinking of glasses in speakeasies, yet beneath this glittering surface, a hidden war raged. The organized crime networks Luciano had helped build were thriving, but success brought constant threats. Rival families, ambitious lieutenants, and law enforcement pressure all created a volatile environment. Luciano understood that to maintain power, he could not rely on reputation alone. He needed strategy, foresight, and the ability to manipulate both friends and foes to his advantage. Survival in this hidden war required more than brute force, it demanded intelligence, timing, and psychological mastery. While the streets seemed orderly under the Commission's guidance, tension simmered beneath the surface. Each family still harbored ambition and resentment. Disputes over territory, money, and influence threatened to ignite violence at any moment. Luciano, however, had transformed these rivalries into controlled conflicts, using them as leverage to consolidate his influence. By selectively intervening and mediating disputes, he positioned himself as the indispensable arbiter, the man whose judgment could determine life or death, profit or loss. Government scrutiny intensified during this period. Prohibition had ended in 1933, but it had left behind an entrenched criminal infrastructure. Law enforcement agencies sought to dismantle organized crime, investigating bootlegging rings, gambling operations, and labor rackets. Corruption and bribery were constant tools, but they required constant attention. Luciano cultivated relationships with key political figures, police officials, and union leaders, ensuring that investigations were stalled or diverted whenever possible. In essence, he waged a subtle war against authority, one fought in backroom deals and whispered negotiations rather than on the streets. Yet law enforcement was not his only challenge. Internal threats were equally dangerous. Ambitious lieutenants within his own network sometimes tested boundaries, seeking greater control or questioning decisions. Figures like Vito Genovese and Frank Costello posed constant challenges, requiring careful management to prevent insubordination. Luciano's solution combined reward and intimidation. Competent, loyal subordinates were given autonomy and resources, while those who challenged him were reminded of the consequences of disloyalty, often through quiet but unmistakable demonstrations of force. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to blend diplomacy and ruthlessness. Negotiation was as much a weapon as a gun, and fear was tempered with opportunity. He cultivated loyalty by ensuring that those who served him were well compensated, protected, and included in profitable ventures. At the same time, he maintained a reputation for unpredictability and decisiveness, a psychological edge that kept both allies and rivals in check. No one could ever be entirely certain when Luciano would act or how, which made resistance dangerous and unwise. The hidden war also extended into business operations. Rivalries over gambling, labor rackets, and smuggling routes could escalate quickly, yet Luciano's oversight maintained relative stability. He established rules that regulated territory, profits, and dispute resolution, minimizing open conflict while maximizing control. By imposing a system where every family knew its limits and responsibilities, he reduced chaos while preserving the hierarchical order that ensured loyalty and obedience. At the same time, Luciano had to contend with external pressures from rival ethnic gangs. Irish and Jewish criminal networks were influential in certain sectors, and their ambitions sometimes clashed with Italian interests. Luciano's alliances with Meyer Lansky and others helped bridge these divides, creating cooperative ventures and shared profits. By integrating rival networks into his strategy, He not only strengthened his own operations but also reduced the likelihood of open warfare that could attract unwanted law enforcement attention. The psychological dimension of this hidden war was as critical as the physical. Luciano understood that perception often mattered more than reality. He cultivated an image of calm control, projecting authority while concealing his true intentions. Men who thought themselves independent quickly realized that he was always several steps ahead, a strategist whose mind could anticipate their moves. This combination of intellect, patience, and decisiveness made Luciano's power durable, even in the midst of constant threats. By the late 1930s, Luciano had established a balance of power that few thought possible. The underworld was no longer a chaotic battlefield dominated by fear and impulsive violence. Instead, it had become a managed system, a network of interdependent families and criminal enterprises, regulated by the Commission and overseen by Luciano's strategic vision. Open warfare was rare, confined to calculated operations rather than spontaneous acts of vengeance. Despite this stability, the hidden war never truly ended. Every decision required calculation, every alliance needed nurturing, and every rival had to be monitored. Luciano's life was a constant negotiation between loyalty and betrayal, power and fear. Even minor miscalculations could have fatal consequences, and he was acutely aware that the delicate equilibrium he maintained was both his strength and his vulnerability. Through this period, Luciano perfected the art of controlling chaos without appearing oppressive. He became the invisible hand that guided criminal operations, the unseen authority whose influence extended into every corner of the underworld. By blending psychological insight, strategic alliances, and selective violence, he ensured that his empire thrived even under immense pressure. In essence, the hidden war was not fought with bullets alone, it was waged through diplomacy, manipulation, and the careful orchestration of human behavior. Luciano's ability to navigate this complex landscape solidified his position as the undisputed architect of modern organized crime. The streets may have seemed quiet to outsiders, but underneath, every interaction, every negotiation, and every calculated move contributed to a war that defined the structure, stability, and longevity of his empire. By mastering both the visible and invisible battles of his world, Lucky Luciano transformed the mafia from a loose collection of violent gangs into a disciplined, cooperative, and resilient network. His ability to balance conflict with cooperation, fear with respect, and strategy with ruthlessness ensured that he remained not just a survivor, but the unchallenged master of a hidden war that few even realized existed. The rise of Lucky Luciano was meteoric, but even the most powerful figures must eventually confront the fragility of their own creations. By the late 1930s, Luciano's empire was sprawling, organized, and profitable beyond measure. He controlled the Commission, maintained alliances across ethnic and geographic lines, and had turned violence into a tool of selective precision rather than impulsive revenge. Yet, as the saying went in the underworld, no empire was immune to the law. Despite his careful cultivation of protection, the long arm of the federal government and local authorities was steadily closing in. The fall of Luciano began not in the dark alleys of New York, but in the offices and courtrooms of the city, where law enforcement sought to dismantle organized crime using every tool at their disposal. Prosecutors and investigators had long observed Luciano's operations with frustration. His empire was invisible to the casual observer, seamlessly integrated into legitimate businesses, unions, and political structures. Bribes, favors, and silent compliance from key officials made direct prosecution nearly impossible. Yet Luciano's growing notoriety and the boldness of his operations had attracted attention from those unwilling to accept the mafia's influence. The first cracks appeared not because of his mismanagement, but because the very scale and sophistication of his network made it impossible to remain unseen forever. The initial signs of vulnerability were subtle. Federal agents had begun to infiltrate his gambling and labor operations, gathering intelligence and listening for any hint of criminal activity that could hold up in court. Local police, previously complicit or intimidated, were pressured by political figures to act. Even some of Luciano's closest allies became liabilities. Informants and minor operatives, faced with the threat of prison or death, began to talk. To Luciano, the danger was clear: one loose thread could unravel the entire empire he had so meticulously constructed. The psychological toll of impending exposure was significant. Luciano, a man accustomed to controlling events and people, suddenly faced forces beyond his immediate influence. He could manipulate rivals, allies, and subordinates, but the law operated differently, through evidence, witnesses, and procedural rigor. The hidden war of negotiation and intimidation could no longer shield him. For the first time, Luciano confronted the reality that his intelligence and foresight might not be enough to prevent disaster. Pressure escalated as law enforcement launched high-profile raids and investigations. Newspapers sensationalized his activities, portraying him as the face of organized crime in America. Public outrage fueled political will to act, and federal authorities increasingly targeted Luciano's operations. Undercover agents, wiretaps, and surveillance created a sense of inevitability. To survive, Luciano had to adapt, as he had done so many times before, but this time the stakes were higher, and the adversaries were faceless and institutional. Internal tensions also threatened stability. Some lieutenants feared that Luciano's increasing visibility made them vulnerable, creating distrust within the ranks. Others questioned whether the elaborate system of the commission could withstand sustained government scrutiny. Luciano's skill in managing these relationships was tested like never before. He relied on his psychological insight to reassure loyalists, remind potential dissenters of their obligations, and neutralize those whose uncertainty could jeopardize operations. Every interaction became a calculation, every conversation a potential turning point in the battle for survival. Then came the critical blow: the government began pursuing charges that could not easily be evaded. Luciano's involvement in prostitution rings, gambling operations, and labor rackets, though long shielded by bribery and corruption, was now under the microscope of a determined federal prosecutor. The legal system, once distant and deferential, had become a direct threat. Luciano had to confront the uncomfortable reality that his empire, for all its sophistication, was vulnerable to the mechanisms of law enforcement. The psychological dynamics of betrayal also emerged during this period. Some associates, facing the threat of long prison sentences, began cooperating with authorities. Others, motivated by envy or ambition, provided damaging testimony. The very system of loyalty and mutual benefit that Luciano had built to secure obedience was now being tested. He realized that even the strongest alliances could crumble under pressure, and that survival depended on both foresight and ruthlessness. Facing this dual threat, from law enforcement outside and potential betrayal within, Luciano began to take defensive measures. He reinforced loyalty among trusted operatives, redistributed responsibilities to protect himself, and attempted to compartmentalize operations to limit exposure. Despite these efforts, the net was tightening. The fall of a criminal empire is rarely sudden; it creeps forward, methodically, exploiting small weaknesses until the structure collapses. For Luciano, the fall was beginning quietly, almost imperceptibly, but its momentum was unstoppable. The arrest of key lieutenants sent shockwaves through his organization. The legal system now had witnesses, evidence, and leverage to attack him indirectly. It was no longer a question of luck or strategy on the street, it was a question of whether his brilliance could outmatch the procedural rigor of the courts. In this phase, Luciano's psychological mastery of men and situations, which had served him so well in life-and-death struggles, faced an entirely new test: surviving an institution designed to uphold law and order. By the time authorities moved to arrest Luciano himself, the reality of his empire's vulnerability was undeniable. The years of careful planning, strategic alliances, and controlled violence had created wealth, power, and respect, but they could not fully protect him from the reach of the legal system. In this sense, the fall of Lucky Luciano was a study in the limits of human control. Even the most intelligent, cautious, and ruthless figure could not completely evade the consequences of an empire built on crime. In the final months before his arrest, Luciano's empire began to feel the pressures of overextension. Minor miscalculations, betrayals, and public exposure compounded, creating cracks that law enforcement could exploit. The psychological weight of inevitable confrontation was heavy, yet he faced it with the same strategic mindset that had guided him through the streets, wars, and politics of the underworld. Every decision became a defensive maneuver, every meeting a potential threat. The fall of Lucky Luciano began not with a single dramatic event, but as a slow erosion of control. It was the convergence of external scrutiny, internal betrayal, and the limits of human management. For a man who had mastered power, manipulated alliances, and controlled fear with genius, this was a humbling and dangerous moment, a reminder that even the most formidable empire is vulnerable when faced with forces beyond its architect's immediate control. This period of decline set the stage for one of the most dramatic chapters in American organized crime history. Luciano's empire, which had been the pinnacle of criminal innovation, was about to face legal, political, and psychological challenges that would test the durability of the system he had created. His survival, influence, and ultimate legacy would depend not on street intelligence alone, but on the ability to navigate the intricate, unforgiving machinery of law, betrayal, and human ambition. The courtroom became the new battlefield. For Lucky Luciano, a man accustomed to exercising control over men, territory, and the invisible levers of power, the trial was a psychological crucible unlike any he had faced. This was a theater where violence alone could not ensure victory, and where reputation, strategy, and perception were just as important as evidence. From the outside, it was a spectacle. The newspapers painted him as the mastermind of a sprawling criminal empire, a man whose influence had penetrated every corner of New York's underworld. To Luciano, however, the trial was a calculated struggle, a contest of intellect, courage, and survival. The charges were severe. Luciano faced accusations ranging from running prostitution rings to orchestrating gambling operations, and authorities were intent on making an example of him. Federal prosecutors, emboldened by the public outrage over organized crime, approached the case with meticulous planning. Investigators combed through ledgers, intercepted communications, and relied on the testimonies of former associates, some coerced, some willing to betray him for self-preservation. Every detail of his empire, the profits, the connections, the clandestine operations, was laid bare in the courtroom. For Luciano, the challenge was both practical and psychological. He knew that conviction could lead to decades behind bars, effectively ending his reign over the underworld. But more than that, the trial represented a test of his image, his influence, and the loyalty he had cultivated over decades. In a world where perception could be as lethal as a gun, he had to navigate public opinion, media scrutiny, and the personal dynamics of the courtroom with the same precision he had applied to running his empire. The courtroom drama unfolded like a carefully scripted play. Prosecutors presented witnesses, each recounting moments of betrayal, complicity, and criminal enterprise. Evidence of financial records, correspondence, and organizational hierarchy painted a picture of an empire that had operated with ruthless efficiency. The media coverage amplified every detail, framing Luciano not as a businessman with a criminal portfolio, but as the personification of danger, cunning, and moral corruption. To the public, he was both feared and fascinated, a man who had challenged the law and won on the streets, but now faced the ultimate test. Luciano's defense was equally strategic. He understood the importance of controlling the narrative, even in a courtroom filled with evidence seemingly stacked against him. His legal team highlighted the inconsistencies in witness testimonies, questioned motives, and sought to undermine the credibility of key accusers. Luciano himself maintained a demeanor of calm confidence, projecting an image of a man above panic, unshaken by the weight of the charges. This psychological posture was crucial, signaling both to the jury and to his associates that he remained in command, even while the law closed in. The trial also illuminated the complexities of organized crime. For the first time, the public could glimpse the intricate mechanisms of Luciano's empire, how alliances were formed, profits distributed, and authority maintained. It revealed a world where crime was not random or chaotic, but governed by rules, hierarchy, and calculated decisions. Yet for prosecutors, the human dimension, the fear, manipulation, and loyalty, was just as important as the material evidence. Convicting Luciano required proving not only the operations he ran but also the intent, influence, and orchestration behind them. Throughout the proceedings, tension between the courtroom and the streets was palpable. Luciano's allies watched closely, concerned for both his freedom and the stability of the empire. Subordinates feared that a conviction would destabilize the carefully constructed network of power, while rivals sensed opportunity in potential weakness. The psychological interplay of fear, loyalty, and ambition played out simultaneously in the courtroom and on the streets, illustrating the inextricable link between perception and control in organized crime. As the trial progressed, media coverage amplified every detail. Newspapers sensationalized the proceedings, framing Luciano as both criminal genius and public menace. This attention increased pressure on prosecutors to secure a conviction, while also complicating Luciano's defense by influencing public opinion and jury perceptions. The courtroom became a stage for performance as much as legal argument, with each side acutely aware that the outcome would reverberate far beyond the immediate parties involved. Luciano's tactical brilliance was evident in his handling of the testimony. He remained composed under hostile questioning, choosing his words carefully, projecting both confidence and restraint. Even when evidence appeared damning, he employed a calm demeanor and subtle manipulation to cast doubt on the prosecution's case. It was a display of psychological warfare, turning the courtroom into a chessboard where every statement, gesture, and reaction was part of a calculated strategy. Despite his efforts, the overwhelming weight of organized evidence and coordinated testimony ultimately proved formidable. The government's case, constructed over years of investigation, painted a portrait of a man whose influence had shaped the underworld and whose operations had left a trail of victims, witnesses, and accomplices. While Luciano's defense team fought to dismantle this narrative, the enormity of the case and the precision of the government's evidence made acquittal unlikely. The sentence, when it came, was both dramatic and symbolic. Luciano was convicted and handed a significant prison term, a moment that marked the beginning of his public fall from power. It was a turning point not only for him personally but for the structure of organized crime in America. The trial exposed vulnerabilities in the system he had created, revealing that even the most sophisticated criminal network could not be entirely insulated from legal authority. Yet even in conviction, Luciano's psychological mastery remained evident. He understood that imprisonment did not have to mean the end of influence. From his cell, he could continue to manage operations, direct associates, and maintain his empire through careful communication and loyal intermediaries. The trial, while a personal defeat in one sense, became another arena in which his strategic mind could operate, proving that power in the underworld was as much about adaptation as domination. The trial of Lucky Luciano was a landmark in American criminal history. It was more than a legal proceeding, it was a public exposition of organized crime, a study in human psychology, and a test of the limits of control and influence. It illustrated that even the most intelligent and ruthless figures are vulnerable to systems larger than themselves, yet also demonstrated that influence, foresight, and the manipulation of loyalty could extend power even beyond the courtroom and behind prison walls. In this chapter of his life, Luciano learned the duality of power, that it is both a shield and a target. The courtroom became a crucible where intellect, reputation, and strategy were tested against evidence, law, and public perception. And while the verdict marked the formal beginning of his personal downfall, it also set the stage for his continued influence, showing that true power in the underworld is not only about presence on the streets but also about the ability to endure, adapt, and manipulate events long after the gavel falls. Even behind bars, Lucky Luciano's influence did not wane. Prison, for most, would have been a place of isolation, despair, and the slow erosion of power. But for Luciano, it became another arena in which to exercise control, shape alliances, and consolidate authority. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that leadership was not solely about physical presence, it was about perception, psychological influence, and the ability to orchestrate events from a distance. In many ways, his incarceration proved that the empire he had built was resilient, adaptable, and deeply dependent on the network of loyalty and fear he had cultivated over years. Luciano quickly established himself as the dominant figure within the prison system. His reputation preceded him, inmates and guards alike recognized the weight of his authority, and many sought to align themselves with him for protection or advantage. He navigated the prison hierarchy with the same precision that had guided him through the streets of New York, using a combination of charisma, intimidation, and strategic alliances. Those who underestimated him soon learned that even behind bars, he could influence decisions, assign responsibilities, and maintain the loyalty of those around him. Communication became a key tool in sustaining his power. Luciano relied on intermediaries, trusted lieutenants, and coded messages to manage operations outside the prison walls. His instructions were clear, precise, and carried the weight of authority, ensuring that business continued uninterrupted. Despite the physical barriers, Luciano remained the central node in a complex network of criminal operations, demonstrating that leadership was as much about psychological control as physical mobility. Within the prison, Luciano also exercised political intelligence. He recognized that officials, guards, and other influential figures could be leveraged to his advantage. Bribes, favors, and subtle persuasion allowed him to secure privileges, protect his allies, and maintain a position of influence. He understood the human dynamics of fear, respect, and ambition, and used these forces to create a mini-ecosystem in which he retained dominance. The prison walls, rather than diminishing his power, became a stage for demonstrating his strategic acumen. At the same time, Luciano remained attentive to the external threats facing his empire. He knew that rival mobsters might attempt to seize control of operations in his absence. To counter this, he implemented a system of delegation and accountability, assigning trusted lieutenants to manage day-to-day operations while keeping ultimate authority centralized. Instructions were precise, contingencies were outlined, and loyalty was constantly reinforced through rewards and consequences. In this way, Luciano ensured that his absence did not destabilize the network he had built with such care. The psychological dimension of maintaining control from prison was complex. Luciano had to project strength and confidence despite personal confinement, while also signaling to allies that he remained fully capable of decisive action. He cultivated an aura of omnipresence. His influence was felt in every major decision, every strategic move, and every dispute resolution. Rivals who might have been tempted to test his authority were reminded, subtly but unmistakably, that his reach extended far beyond the physical confines of a cell. Luciano also used his incarceration to reflect and refine strategy. Removed from the immediate pressures of street-level conflict, he had the opportunity to observe patterns, reassess alliances, and anticipate future challenges. This period of enforced distance allowed him to refine the organizational structure of his empire, improve communication channels, and strengthen the mechanisms of loyalty and accountability. In many ways, the prison years were a laboratory for strategic innovation, a time to perfect the systems that would sustain his empire long-term. His continued influence in the outside world was facilitated by an intricate web of intermediaries. Each lieutenant, each trusted associate, understood that Luciano's authority was absolute, that decisions flowed from him, and that consequences for disobedience could be swift and severe. The network operated like a well-oiled machine, with Luciano at its center, orchestrating operations ranging from gambling to labor rackets, and even advising on alliances and conflict resolution. His presence was invisible yet omnipotent, a demonstration of the power of intellect and perception over mere physical freedom. Even within the prison environment, Luciano faced threats and challenges. Other inmates, ambitious or resentful, occasionally tested boundaries, seeking to assert their own influence. Luciano addressed these challenges with a combination of diplomacy, intimidation, and strategic alliances, ensuring that potential rivals were either incorporated into his network or neutralized. By managing internal threats carefully, he maintained dominance and reinforced the perception that his authority was unassailable, regardless of location. The federal authorities were aware of Luciano's ongoing influence, and efforts were made to limit his communications. Yet his ability to adapt and innovate allowed him to circumvent many obstacles. Trusted messengers, coded language, and careful delegation ensured that operations continued with minimal disruption. Luciano's prison years demonstrated that a sophisticated, hierarchical criminal network could function even when its leader was physically removed, a testament to the resilience and foresight of the systems he had built. This period also showcased the psychological sophistication that had always distinguished Luciano. He understood that power was as much about perception as it was about action. By projecting calm authority, maintaining control of information, and demonstrating strategic foresight, he ensured that allies remained loyal, rivals cautious, and law enforcement uncertain of the extent of his influence. Even in confinement, he remained a central figure whose decisions shaped the criminal landscape of New York and beyond. By the time his sentence had progressed, it was clear that Luciano's influence had not been diminished by imprisonment. The empire he had built continued to function effectively, rival factions remained contained, and his strategic vision guided operations from afar. His capacity to manage, inspire, and control from within a prison cell underscored the true nature of his genius. Leadership was not dependent on physical presence alone, but on intellect, perception, and the ability to orchestrate human behavior with precision. Lucky Luciano's prison years were a paradoxical blend of limitation and power. Physically confined, he was psychologically and strategically unbound, demonstrating that influence could transcend walls and bars. His empire continued to thrive because he had anticipated the challenges of absence, designed a resilient organizational structure, and understood the subtleties of human motivation. In the end, prison was not a period of weakness, it was an extension of his battlefield, a proving ground where his genius for strategy, leadership, and control was exercised under the most constrained and challenging conditions imaginable. After his release from prison in 1946, Lucky Luciano was deported to Italy, a move designed by U.S. authorities to remove his influence from American soil while keeping some control over organized crime. For Luciano, exile could have been a symbolic and practical end. He was removed from the streets, the alliances, and the empire he had spent decades building. Yet, true to his nature, Luciano approached the challenge strategically, understanding that influence was not solely tied to physical presence. Even in Naples, he could continue to shape operations, guide allies, and maintain his status as a figure whose decisions mattered across continents. Post-war Italy presented a fractured and chaotic environment. Cities like Naples were struggling to rebuild from wartime destruction, and criminal organizations were fragmented, competing for control in a landscape of instability. Luciano immediately assessed the local landscape, identifying opportunities to extend influence. He recognized that, though he had lost direct control over New York, his reputation, experience, and strategic mind were valuable tools that could be leveraged to broker alliances, mediate disputes, and advise local factions. His understanding of human psychology and organizational structure allowed him to exert power indirectly, demonstrating that authority could survive even in displacement. Exile also provided space for reflection and recalibration. Removed from the pressures of the street and the constant threat of immediate violence, Luciano could evaluate his life, his mistakes, and the consequences of his empire. He observed the next generation of American mobsters, recognizing both the legacy of his innovations and the risks posed by evolving threats. This distance reinforced an important lesson: leadership requires foresight, patience, and adaptability, not just bold action. Luciano refined his strategies, considering how to maintain loyalty, prevent internal betrayal, and extend influence through intermediaries. Maintaining connections with trusted lieutenants in America became essential. Through careful delegation, coded communication, and loyal intermediaries, he ensured that operations continued smoothly. Rival factions were managed, disputes resolved, and his vision for organized crime in New York persisted despite his absence. His influence was felt in labor rackets, gambling, and alliances, proving that leadership could operate remotely when built on reputation, trust, and psychological leverage. Exile also demonstrated Luciano's ability to adapt to new cultural and political realities. He forged relationships with local authorities, businessmen, and emerging criminal networks in post-war Italy, leveraging the instability and opportunities of Reconstruction to his advantage. His approach combined diplomacy, intimidation, and strategic insight, allowing him to maintain relevance in a foreign context. Italy became a stage where his genius for organization and control could continue, albeit in a more indirect, advisory capacity. Yet exile also underscored the limits of power. Luciano no longer wielded the immediate, tangible authority of the streets, his influence depended on the perception and obedience of others. He learned to operate with subtlety, relying on negotiation and strategic vision rather than force. This phase of his life highlighted the resilience of systems he had created, well-structured organizations, loyalty networks, and hierarchies that could function even without his direct presence. Ultimately, Luciano's exile and final years were a demonstration of adaptability, foresight, and psychological mastery. He remained a central figure in organized crime, influencing operations from afar, mediating disputes, and maintaining the structures he had built. Exile was both a constraint and an opportunity, proving that power is not merely about dominance or territory but about strategy, perception, and the ability to orchestrate human behavior. Even removed from New York, Luciano's legacy and control endured, cementing his status as a master architect of the modern mafia and a figure whose influence transcended geography, imprisonment, and the passage of time. Lucky Luciano reshaped organized crime in America and beyond, creating systems that transformed chaos into a disciplined network. Before him, the mafia operated in violent, fragmented turf wars. He introduced structure, hierarchy, and negotiation, establishing the commission to mediate disputes and coordinate operations. His genius lay not only in organization but in psychological mastery. Loyalty, fear, and ambition became tools to maintain authority, extending his influence even from prison and exile. Luciano's inclusive strategy, collaborating with Jewish, Irish, and other criminal groups, set a precedent for transnational cooperation. He integrated criminal enterprises into legitimate institutions, leveraging politics, unions, and social systems to protect and expand his power. These methods were sophisticated, combining strategy, foresight, and perception to control people and circumstances. His life also underscores the moral ambiguity of leadership in crime. Countless lives were affected by the operations he oversaw, from violence to corruption, highlighting the human cost behind his brilliance. Yet his innovations endure as a blueprint for organized crime, hierarchical organization, strategic alliances, and calculated influence remain defining features of modern criminal enterprises. Luciano's story illustrates the limits and resilience of power. Even imprisonment and exile could not sever his influence. By maintaining operations through loyal intermediaries and strategic oversight, he demonstrated that leadership transcends physical presence. His life is both a study in strategic genius and a cautionary tale, blending ambition, intellect, and the exercise of authority in ways that continue to inform the history and psychology of power. Lucky Luciano's life ended in Naples in 1962, far from the streets of New York, yet his influence persisted. He had transformed the mafia from fragmented gangs into a structured, cooperative network, proving that true power relies on strategy, perception, and organization, not merely violence. Even in exile, he continued to guide operations, demonstrating the resilience and adaptability of his systems. Culturally, Luciano became the archetype of the modern mobster, brilliant, ruthless, and strategic. Films, literature, and media have perpetuated his myth, showing society's fascination with power, ambition, and moral complexity. Yet behind the legend lies the human cost. Violence, corruption, and manipulation shaped the lives of countless individuals. His story is therefore both inspiring and cautionary. Luciano's innovations, hierarchical structure, interethnic collaboration, and strategic integration with social institutions, reshaped organized crime globally. His ability to maintain influence from prison and exile illustrates that leadership extends beyond proximity, relying on credibility, foresight, and human insight. His empire endured because it was built on organization, loyalty, and calculated psychological control. Ultimately, Luciano's life reflects the duality of power, achievement and consequence, genius and ruthlessness, influence and vulnerability. His rise, empire, trials, and exile offer enduring lessons in leadership, strategy, and human behavior. His story remains a powerful lens for understanding ambition, authority, and the complex forces that shape both individuals and the systems they create, securing his place as one of history's most consequential figures in organized crime.